just going back to the question about belief and Asad, he's working through some of those ideas himself, but embedding them in a kind of understanding of embodiment and power, etc. So I think that just speaks to the fact that, like, in the context of Islam, at least, I don't think it makes sense to be like, well, we're not going to talk about belief, interior. I mean, what do we even mean by belief is so complicated. So if there's a lot of stuff going on inside of people that Islamic thought and Muslims are concerned about. And so we can't just ignore it.
Hello and welcome to Protean View. I'm Riyadh as always, and with me as co-host is Mohammed Bushra, our managing editor at Muftah. We're joined for this episode by Zaid Adhami. He's an associate professor in the Department of Religion at Williams College and the author of Dilemmas of Authenticity, the American Muslim Crisis of Faith. Professor Adhami kindly agreed to talk to us about his new book and what authenticity, crisis, and belief mean in relation to each other. In a moment, you'll hear that discussion, but first I want to say a quick thank you to our supporters on Substack and Patreon for helping make this episode possible, and I invite listeners of the show to consider joining our community on Substack at muftah.org and Patreon at patreon.com/proteanview, which you can do for as low as $5 a month. To help keep us running, please do follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you find your podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at muftah.org to stay updated on the latest from us. Thanks for listening and for your support. And here now is our conversation with Zaid Adhami. Zaid, thank you very much for joining us. Could you start by just explaining what you mean by authenticity? Why did you write a book about authenticity? Is authenticity just being true to oneself, or is it something more than that?
Great way to start. So I didn't set out to write a book about authenticity. It was actually pretty late stage in the development of the book that I arrived at that as the central framework that I was using. And that's something, maybe we can talk about. But what am I trying to get at by using that? So I talk about how there's two senses to the word. So, authenticity, at a more kind of linguistic or literal level, refers to something being, the realness of something, right? So is this, we could think of it in terms of objects or some kind of tangible entity, like, is this a real Rolex? Is this a real diamond? Is this a real pair of Jordans? And that gets applied to cultural, historical entities. So is this real Thai food? Is this real Black culture? Is this authentic Islam or Islamic tradition? Now, that kind of measureness of realness and authenticity also gets applied through a certain history to the individual, to the realness of the self, looking inward to asking, what is the real self? How does one kind of follow or lead their life in a way that reflects that authentic, real inner self? Now, so these two are obviously connected in a certain way, but they also get treated in very different ways. Both are relevant to the story I'm telling in the book, but I end up focusing primarily on the latter, which is what you were getting at. And what I'm trying to say, I don't particularly buy the idea of personal authenticity. I'm skeptical and critical of it. I do think as an ethos, it points to values and maybe even virtues that might be meaningful and important. But as a kind of ideology or an ideal in and of itself, the aspiration to kind of be true to oneself, the way that this has kind of developed in the modern West, for example, in this case, it ends up being an incoherent project, I believe, because it's linked. The way that this concept or ideal emerges within the context of Christendom and post-Christendom in the West is both connected initially in a kind of pietistic vein to an idea of, if you turn inward into the heart, you will connect with your real self, which you will find God, to put it to simplify things. Through, like, let's say the Romantic period, with figures like Rousseau, where that inward turn is against the kind of stricter, the kind of conventions of civilization and society that make you alienated from your true nature as a person. And in there is some kind of, whether in Rousseau and romantic thought or in like transcendentalists like Emerson, there's a kind of, there's something of a sort of pantheism of sorts, let's say, where when you connect to that inner self and inner nature deep inside that the inner cosmos, you end up connecting with some transcendent reality as well. This idea of the self is embedded in these larger cosmic frames, whether it's the Christian God or whether it's some kind of more pantheistic notion. It also is connected to a certain politics, like I was suggesting, kind of alluding to with Rousseau. It's kind of tied to an idea of the self being alienated by the kind of demands and constraints of society and civilization and needing to be trying to be freed of that. And so, like, for example, in when we think of a certain kind of version of this, like in, let's say, the hippie generation as this kind of caricature in the 60s, it's tied to a kind of radical utopianism at the collective level as well. It's tied to a transformation of society. So it's a complicated thing, and the notion that capitalism, materialism, is alienating us from some real kind of inner core of what it means to be human. Now, why do I say it? Why am I bringing up all this? Is that I think what happens through the kind of through the end, by the end of the Cold War into like this neoliberal context that we're in, is that that ideal gets kind of all those various elements that this is embedded in get stripped away, and all you get remaining at the end is this notion of an individual having a true self and that you should be your real self. And when you just scratch a little under the surface, it's really not that hard to see that it becomes a pretty incoherent notion in that, like, well, which aspect of the self are you supposed to be true to? I'm inclined towards this and I'm inclined towards that. I am committed to not being a racist, but I find myself like feeling, pejoratively about certain people. And so which part of myself do I lean into? And that's kind of one aspect of what I'm getting at, even with this idea of the dilemmas of authenticity, that like when you put that as an ideal and as an aspiration, is that you need to look inward, dig inward, and be true to yourself. It's not like there's a straightforward trajectory of what that's supposed to mean. Nonetheless, I do find that, when we talk about that if our age is an age of authenticity, like people like Taylor have said, for example, that part of what we mean by that is in a culture that really emphasizes personal authenticity, there's a whole, what I say in the intro, a whole constellation of values that this is kind of connected to. So sincerity, introspection, self-scrutiny, wholeheartedness, choice, and autonomy. There's a whole bunch of values that it gets associated with, and a certain kind of ethic, whether of interpersonal relationships or with the relationship with oneself. And I also don't want to discard all of that, like all of those values that might be emphasized might in various ways be meaningful or productive, but as an end in and of itself, as it kind of comes to be seen, like it's almost like the ultimate value of any politics is to be true to oneself. And in that vein, I find it kind of incoherent, to be a bit bold and put it bluntly, in a way that I don't really put that clearly in the book.
You mentioned Charles Taylor, so I want to ask a question about him. You sound to me to be a little more critical of this idea of being true to oneself than perhaps he is in his work, but you're not necessarily going in the direction where, for example, you have someone like Christopher Lasch who says this movement or culture of being true to oneself leads toward pure narcissism. Where do you fit in that debate?
So in terms of how I read Taylor, for one, I mean, I think so in his thinner book, the older book, it's not. I mean, I've taught it and then realized it's not that great, but in terms of how it's written, but in the ethics of authenticity, what he's trying to say is that, yeah, look, yes, this kind of ideal of authenticity can basically amount to narcissism, the way that these critics have said. And but he's trying to hold on to, he's trying to put forward a way that it, that there's something that can be reclaimed or, you know, taken from that it doesn't just devolve into relativistic narcissism and hedonism and stuff. So that there is a kind of way that it can be not purely individualistic and yet value the individual. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to critiques like that you mentioned of Lash and others about the way that this gets reduced to, or the way that this really reflects a certain kind of narcissism. I focus a lot in my teaching and just my personal like commitments and conviction, very troubled by the kind of directions of it within this kind of late capitalist consumer culture, and just how there is no framework to ground anything beyond the self. So I mean, I'm very sympathetic to those critiques, and I very much try to get my students to see that all the time. But I do think, I mean, as I think the book maybe demonstrates, there's a certain kind of sympathy or recognition that like it's not something that we can just easily step out of all that easily. It's not, and that ethos might be pointing to certain things that are valuable if they're taken, And I hate to, it's very lame when we kind of be like, oh, everything's in moderation or not taken to the extreme. But I don't know how to be more sophisticated than that, perhaps. But say, some of these things are important. When I think about the stories of the people, I was talking to and became friends with, and more broadly, there's something about this kind of ethos that is meaningful, that we isn't just, like, oh, this is just, we can just dismiss it out of hand. Like, there's something there. So bringing it to an Islamic context, for example, I think there is certainly something to be said for the value of an aspiration for one's sincerity, for aligning one's inner world and with one's actions and dispositions to the world. So if authenticity is in part about trying to engage in introspection, to kind of become more self-aware, to unify one's convictions with one's kind of, to not be so internally like fragmented and stuff. There is something there, and something that is an aspiration within Islamic pietistic like ideals of aligning oneself with God and with truth, etc. But when it can become, I think it needs to be tempered, and can kind of lead in various kind of maybe destructive paths. I don't know if that's adequate.
So then how does it lead to both crisis and reconciliation? As you mentioned in the book, how is authenticity a driving force in that regard?
So that's maybe a way to get into like, how did I even arrive at this as a kind of central framework? One thing I was trying to do was trying to contextualize why, not just take for granted that like people are, this kind of state of like religious doubt, and that producing some kind of sense of crisis at both an individual and collective level is like just kind of treating it ahistorically, that like this is just what it means, like this is kind of natural to religion. So I'm like thinking about what are the kind of conditions that would produce this kind of experience, this kind of anxiety and discourse. And so what I kind of arrived at in trying to name that and articulate that was that so on the one hand, a kind of drive or imperative of personal authenticity, of being true to yourself, might say, let's say somebody is struggling, somebody is told that this is what Islam demands of you, of you to accept. and feel conflicted about that. They find it hard to accept that. A certain kind, a certain way of interpreting the ideal or moral imperative of being authentic to yourself would say, look, if you look inward, if you look internally within yourself, you will have to admit that you're not really being true to yourself. You're lying to yourself that you accept this thing, because clearly you don't like fully accept it. And so if you're going to live a more authentic life, if you're going to be authentic, true to your real beliefs and convictions, the courageous thing, the manly thing, as a certain kind of theorists would have said 100 years ago, would be to face up to that and abandon those commitments. And usually that means a kind of communal commitment to a certain tradition or something. So that's kind of one avenue that this kind of ideal of personal authenticity might generate a kind of hyper scrutiny of one's inner conflictedness. But that in and of itself is not, it's when that converges with other things that are going on. And so I talk about the convergence of that with a revivalist mode of piety and authenticity that I can talk about in a minute, with the kind of hyper scrutiny and of racialization and Islamophobia that kind of makes you ever aware of all these kinds of conflicts within yourself, a certain kind of double consciousness. So there are other avenues that the ideal of authenticity might generate a sense of crisis as well. This kind of ideal also encourages people to kind of be more assertive in their own, speak your own, like your own truth, your personal truths, your own personal understanding of Islam that might defy or dissent from kind of communal authorities and authoritative discourses that are put forward. And so this might generate a kind of communal sense of crisis, a sense of crisis from people in authority or people invested in a certain idea of orthodoxy or tradition that says, oh my God, all these people are expressing all these things that fly in the face of like true Islam. This is a crisis of faith because they don't properly believe. So there's a kind of collective crisis. There's an a personal crisis. So that's kind of one thing I'm saying. And that way I'm trying to disaggregate, experiences of conflictedness, questioning, doubt, uncertainty, etc. on the one hand, from a notion of crisis. I think crisis does certain kinds of work, not, just because people have certain kinds of uncertainties, it doesn't, outside of certain conditions, that might not amount. That might just be the regular condition of life. But when certain conditions get in place, that can then generate a kind of anxiety and crisis. So, but then speaking to your second question of like, well, in what ways does that allow for a reaffirmation of tradition or a kind of reclaiming, or however we want to put it? Well, this kind of ideal of being true to yourself, or the various features of this discourse of authenticity, what come with it is a certain, authority of the self, a certain kind of emphasis on personal feeling, on personal experience. And so, for example, many people might feel like, yeah, sure, I can't buy into all these like orthodox things out there. I don't agree with so much of the doctrines that are kind of presented to me as necessary to accept. But I have a personal attachment to I have a personal attachment to prayer or reciting Quran and makes me feel very Muslim. And so I'm going to prioritize that personal feeling, and that legitimates. And you see that actually as a trend at a kind of broader scale, that a kind of shift to these debates about, what are the trends in religion in the US. And you get a lot of people who dabble, who engage in various religious traditions or practices or things that we think of as spiritual or magical, or, some kind of aspiration to transcendence of some sort. but they do it in their, their own way. And these are kind of proliferating and exploding. And whether people belong to a particular religious tradition or don't, there's a certain kind of authorization of that, what one caller calls like remixing. Like, so many people have described this in various ways, but that people have the kind of feel that, or they're given the kind of authority to, you know, claim their own truth, so to speak. So it ends up working both ways. And even the last thing I'll say on this, even authority figures within this community, for example, but it applies more broadly, will appeal to this kind of language as well. That like because of the indeterminacy at some level in the public sphere of being able to demonstrate the validity of your tradition as a minoritized person, as a minoritized tradition operating in a public sphere that is not set up on the term, the terms of debate are not your own, then often what is appealed to is that kind of personal feeling, that like that personal experience, personal feeling ends up being a kind of very powerful basis on which to make a claim to truth, make a claim to your belonging to this tradition, etc.
Okay, so in light of what you just discussed about kind of your skepticism towards notions of inner authenticity, which you said you didn't particularly articulate to the same extent in the book, I'm curious about the opening story with which you start the book. Nadia kind of posing a question to the mosque committee, or specifically to the visiting imam, and kind of not being satisfied by the answer, and that kind of driving her on her own path of self-discovery through what she, presents as disbelief until she kind of finds her way back. At some point in discussing this throughout the book, you appear to present at face value her assertion about herself, that she's following her own intuitions, sensibilities, and experiences, which you contrast with the gendered norms and ideologies of the mosque committee and the visiting imam. So it's clear that the mosque committee's positions are reflective of ideological commitments, but as I understand what you're saying just now regarding kind of your skepticism towards these inner notions of authenticity, these are themselves reflective of ideology, perhaps an internalization of the kind of prevailing values and norms of society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at some level, in trying to describe how a sense of doubt or crisis is experienced, then the way it is experienced is that this is a judgment. This is my personal judgment, and I'm being told something else externally to me. And so at that level, that is, what generates this dissonance and this kind of sense of conflict. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, at various points in the book, I try to kind of, point to and analyze the way in which, well, no personal experience is somehow unstructured by broader discourses, ideologies, material realities, etc. We're not, there's no pure autonomy where, so I neither want to say that all personal experiences is powerful ideologies that ventriloquize through people. Like people have there's nothing there. But also to kind of push back on this idea that somehow lived experience or personal experience can unproblematically be a kind of, something we can appeal to without being critical and discerning of like, well, what is forming my personal experience? How am I interpreting the things I'm encountering in life? And, there are some theorists that I found helpful in trying to articulate that middle ground of sorts, or kind of what they call a kind of post-positivist realism of recognizing the social constructedness. But it is also like, that's not all there is. It's like we're formed by so many complex forces, and we're kind of sitting at this nexus of multiple ideologies and discourses. We have we're formed in that way. So that's what gives rise to a certain experience. And it could be experienced otherwise if one kind of undergoes various kinds of like self-critique, etc.
Shifting gears somewhat, I wanted to ask the following. So you study focuses on the US context and more specifically New England, where you conducted your field research. However, I'm wondering if you could speak to the broader applicability of your work's findings in other contexts, in which such discourses as authenticity are proliferating. Specifically, I'm thinking of figures like Grand Ayatollah Kamal al-Haidari, who's Iraqi, who puts forth the notion that it's obligatory to follow one's conscience in belief. So if a person is convinced by Christianity or by Judaism or by atheism, or a particular Islamic sect, they would be sinful if they don't adhere to that conscience and belief.
Interesting. I've not come across that.
So yeah, I mean, as I said, so this is a, I mean, as far as it's an Ash'ari tradition, it's a Orthodox, classically trained scholar, but he is articulating this, which has made him unpopular in certain circles, certainly. But again, this is somewhat a global phenomenon. This
Right.
talk of authenticity.
Right, of course. I mean, for one, that's just interesting. I'm assuming, just based on the very little you said, that I could imagine how he could draw on the Mu'tazili position, for example, that the first wajib, the first obligation on a person that gives birth to every other kind of moral obligation is nazar, like rational reflection. And that is what makes you a mukallaf. Like that's what makes you kind of responsible and accountable in the eyes of God, and that should lead you to the right path. But I guess he's like, well, what if it doesn't? So that's very interesting. And no, I absolutely agree that obviously this kind of ideal of personal authenticity, the kind of broader, I mean, it's one manifestation of, let's say, a broader kind of trajectory of or ideology of individualism and autonomy that structures the modern world in a certain way, or that is deeply tied with the modern West, Euro-American kind of post-Christendom, and as both a kind of a prescriptive ideology as well as certain structural developments that lead to individualization and fragmentation. This is something I've struggled with for a very long time, is how to disentangle the prescriptive ideological dimensions from what seem to be like empirically like real developments in which individuals get disembedded from certain social structures and have certain kinds of freedom, so to speak, less constraint in relation to certain kinds of relationships, while becoming less free in relation to the state and capital, for example. But so all that to say, yes, I only am focusing on the US because I'm trying to historicize, locate this particular phenomenon I'm looking at and be like, okay, what makes it what gives rise to this in particular in this context? So there's a certain kind of convergence of factors. To the extent that this individualism, this ideology of individualism is part of the modern West that is obviously transnational and global in its power. And to the extent that the kind of global Islamic revivalism piece that I'm talking about is also transnational, then this is not particularly unique probably to the US context. But I also don't want to speak much about I feel like, well, my job was to try to, as best as I can, describe these conditions here. And if people are interested in this, to kind of, I would learn from people to see in what ways is it applicable or not applicable beyond. I feel like I wouldn't be the best judge of that. But one interesting example in a less theological vein that I thought of as you were talking, there's this singer in the Middle East, Hamoud al-Khudr. Are you guys familiar with him? He's like this. It's kind of like pop music that is like religiously, ethically infused, but it's kind of secular. Like it's not like nasheed that very explicitly invokes God and Islam in very overt ways, but it's very value-based music, right? It's that similar to like kind of Christian pop music that's not all about Jesus, but is very much values music. So that's what he does. He's pretty good. So he has this song from about 10 years ago, maybe a little more, called Kun Anta, and which means literally it translates to be yourself in English, but it's like, if you know Arabic, it's the lyrics of the song are so bizarre because he is inventing phrases in Arabic to reflect the English terminology around personal authenticity. So be yourself. So the refrain is kun anta, be yourself, which, again, it wouldn't make sense to an Arabic speaker. But then he says, سأكون أنا من أرضى أنا. Like, so all this like weird way of like grammatically phrasing things to like speak about being real to yourself. And his purpose in the song is to critique social conformity and materialism. So it's a very like, and the music video is all about rejecting like the fashions and fads of consumerism. So there's something powerful in it. But he's like totally inventing a new language for personal authenticity in Arabic that sounds so strange too. So anyways, that's just kind of a funny example. But I don't know, obviously there are developments of, there have been for a long time developments of secular critique of Islam around the Muslim world, people expressing disillusionment and doubt, people leaving Islam around in the Arab world, in Iran, and in different parts of the world. It would be an interesting exploration to see to what extent is that articulated in this ethos of personal authenticity versus like, let's say, a kind of more objectivist scientific rationalism. Let's say, like, let's posit those as like somewhat parallel discourses that can be opposed with each other, to the extent that like this individualistic authenticity discourse is very much about your own personal truths and is somewhat relativistic, as opposed to, concerns with more kind of objective scientific fact. Like, I don't know, like these are interesting questions to think about. Is it manifesting in the same way? Like, yes, there is critique of so-called orthodoxies. There's critique of, there's doubt, there's questioning, there's crisis of faith. But does it manifest in the same way? Maybe you guys would be better positioned to answer that than me if you have thoughts about that.
No, I think that was great. And yeah, no, thanks for the recommendation, the Hamid al-Khadr. I'm just looking it up now, looking at the lyrics.
I did want to ask a question about belief. There are a number of books out there on Islam and crisis and the relationship between Islam and this idea of crisis. But I don't think there are there are many books, rather, I don't think there are many books on Islam and the crisis of Islam, or Islam in crisis, that deal with belief head on in the way that your book does. So why approach this subject from the vantage point of belief? Why recenter what Talal Asad and his students made painstaking efforts to dislodge? You mentioned in the book that religious studies as a field has kind of hesitated to approach the subject of belief. And I think part of that has to do with the influence of the Asadian tradition and their insistence that focusing on belief leads us to neglect the discursivity of religion, right? And the idea of embodiment, for example. So why is belief important to you? And how do you kind of respond to those who say we should kind of move away from belief in the study of religion?
Big question, been grappling with for a long time, since at least comps in grad school. The less academic answer is the biographical, that like this was part of my own, like I was working through things that led me to a certain path of academic exploration in which that was a meaningful question. And in fact, the first version of this book after the dissertation was titled Questioning Belief rather than Dilemmas of Authenticity. And what I meant by questioning belief was twofold. One was colloquially the idea of questioning belief, that Muslims are questioning belief and like having doubts and stuff. But then also questioning belief as an analytical category, both, what is belief? What do we mean when we talk of belief? And what is the efficacy of using this as an analytical category? And so engaging some of that. So that was my first version. And I can talk about why I moved away from it. But in any case, So religious studies scholars and anthropologists have, like you said, cautioned of uncritical, naive adaptation of this category and using it to describe different traditions, etc. So for one, I think when we have these methodological turns in the humanities, I don't think, for me, making note of the way that that belief gets read through a certain prism, that this category has kind of is kind of coming with all sorts of Protestant baggage, that then gets overemphasized and understood to be like the kind of principal basis upon which social life is organized. That like the critique is that like, well, this is a very like cognitivist picture of the world, that like people have ideas in their minds and then they act on them and then do practices and build institutions on the basis of belief in this linear like direction. And that it's a kind of overemphasis on belief and a kind of static understanding of all these kinds of things. All that is very valuable. But whenever we have any of these methodological turns, to then say, well, therefore we're going to not study that thing or not approach that thing anymore, to me that's not the answer, because the reality is that, well, why am I looking at belief? Well, because people care about belief. The people I'm talking to care about belief. Within the context of Islamic studies, Islamic thought, like Muslim communities, to be like, again, there's a problem of translation, and we can work through all of that. And, I could talk about this for about 2 hours, or more, probably more. There's another book somewhere in there. But, like people are very concerned with like figuring out what they believe on the, and concerned with interiority and how beliefs, how whatever, their internal dispositions, their internal thoughts, etc., line up with discourses, that are being put forward in society, etc. So the answer to me is not to disregard that and say, well, methodologically, we're not going to focus on that. The answer is to say, okay, to the extent those those critiques are great. They're pointing out certain important things. Sometimes I disagree with certain things. So a lot of times it's very valuable. But like, how do I apply that in concrete practice? Like, it's easy to kind of to engage in these critiques at a theoretical level. But then when I'm trying to empirically analyze something where people are talking about what, their interiority, their faith commitment, their doubts, their et cetera, their desire for conviction and certainty, but their inability to achieve it, or their worries that they don't have belief, or all these things. Well, then we need a way to kind of try to analyze that properly. Now, it can be done better and worse. I mean, could there be more of a focus on embodiment in this book? Yeah, definitely. Did I know how to do it? No. I wasn't quite able to translate most of those insights into the way my ethnography played out, the way I was analyzing these things. But so that's just kind of the simple answer, I think. But I try to kind of I hope that like when one kind of is informed by these kinds of critiques and methodological developments, that it makes you careful in your analysis. So disentangling belief from, recognizing that belief is not straightforward, and that we assume all sorts of things about authenticity precisely when we talk about belief, like this kind of belief-centered framework. Some of the critique is about a naive assumption about human agency as kind of governed by this kind of authenticity.
Out of curiosity, how much of belief is a choice in your view? I'm thinking here of the story of Nadia that we talked about. It seems to me that belief in her case was not so much that she didn't want to believe. It sounded to me like she didn't want to not believe, but she didn't want to believe either. Does that make sense?
Right.
More than anything, it sounds like she was just trying to contend with what she believed, not whether she did. And that's what I mean when I ask how much of belief do you, in your view, is a choice? I
Right.
can say more about that if that helps.
Well, let me take it somewhere. See if that's what you were, if if that's what you're thinking about. So another story that kind of captures this that I spend a lot of time thinking about, like this kind of concern with freedom and choice of belief, is in chapter 5. I talk about Zainab, who is grappling with pretty similar issues. You might say is a kind of similar profile. So kind of has a certain kind of commitment to a feminist politics, doesn't quite know how to square that. Is working very, is actually like very well, reading a lot, very sharp, but still feels a certain kind of, is troubled by, you know, by what she encounters in scripture and tradition and communal kind of dominant communal understandings. But so then she kind of starts to talk in the way of like Islam as her default, and that it's kind of something you fall back on as a habit. And what I kind of point out that like, and something that is just, I mean, she kind of talks about it as an inheritance, right? Like something you've kind of acquired throughout life. But she doesn't mean that she's just like, I'm a cultural Muslim. Like for her, it matters. It matters a lot in how you lead your life. But it's also kind of like, it doesn't have can't find good reasons of how to justify her belief, and feel at some level that it's something that's a given in her life. And so through this kind of idea of a default and habit, I get into like this idea of volition, of choice, and kind of in conversation with Saba Mahmoud. And I don't really have an answer, just in that it's a, at least my analysis in that story and my kind of reading of Mahmoud and Politics of Piety is that it's a both and. Like there's a way in which one is habituated into a form of life, and certain things just feel like this is just such a deep part of me, and I don't know how to just move away from it. I don't know how to reject it. Even when you come to some kind of moment of crisis and you want to reject it, then feeling a certain kind of inability to do so. And so that's where, maybe practice and embodiment matter, in that like, well, you've been habituated into a whole way of living. Just suddenly like deciding that you don't accept this thing is, and that kind of marking some radical shift in your way of living, in your subjectivity, etc. That's very hard to do. And so I draw on, Samuli Shielke's reading of Mahmoud, kind of, I think helpfully just kind of points out that, how does he put it? These small moments of practice and decisions can lead one in a trajectory. So I think, so let's say in that opening story of Nadia, when she started seeing herself as an atheist, if she was like, well, I have chosen to not believe, and so now I'm going to start eating pork and I'm going to start drinking. She deliberately did not do those things. And that's when she reflects back on it, she's like, those things actually made me feel like I was still clearly invested in this form of life, that I couldn't let it go. And then something happened that kindled a kind of relationship with God. But it's these kind of small practices of like, and so you have, in some books, like there's this new book also, Secular Paradox by Joseph Blankholm, and he talks about lots of different kinds of secular people, but there's a certain good chunk of the book that deals with, ex-Muslims. And a lot of times they have very deliberate things that they need to do to kind of distance themselves, because maybe the way in which, because of the force of habituation, you know, practice and embeddedness in a certain life world produces certain interiority. So all that to say, we don't just freely, we do, there is a certain level of individuation and agency that we have when we, in some of these moments perhaps, but some the things also feel like they're given to us in a way where we can't choose to find but at the level of conviction, well, I can't choose what is persuasive to me and what isn't, what is my mind assenting to and what isn't. And in Muslim theology, and the mutakallimin talk about this a lot, of like tasdeeq is that a non-volitional thing. An assent to a judgment is like something that presents itself to the mind non-volitionally. But then there's a certain element of like, well, what do I tell myself? What do I choose to commit to? And even that is kind of constrained by one's social embeddedness, by one's history of life. But there are, I think, ways that we slowly shift ourselves out of a certain form of life, if that makes sense. One other thing I'll just add, just going back to the question about belief and Asad, I mean, I think Asad himself, it's not like Asad is totally uninterested in, belief or iman. He's trying to show the way in which religious belief comes to be prioritized in a certain way, comes to be a certain kind of optional something that is a volitional choice as opposed to a kind of objective knowledge, for example, as he puts it in the chapter on Geertz. And he kind of has various reflections throughout the years on how he understands iman as a disposition. He's kind of opposing it as a propositional kind of assent of the mind and more kind of relationship of trust and loyalty and commitment. So he's working through some of those ideas himself, but embedding them in a kind of understanding of embodiment and power, etc. So I think that just speaks to the fact that, like, in the context of Islam, at least, I don't think it makes sense to be like, well, we're not going to talk about belief interior. I mean, what do we even mean by belief is so complicated. So if there's a lot of stuff going on inside of people that Islamic thought and Muslims are concerned about. And so we can't just ignore it.
No, I agree. You can't really talk about Islam without talking about belief. I think the point about embodiment for me was just about how it not just embodiment, but this idea of habituation that you brought up. It just complicates our understanding, our common sense understanding of belief a little bit as something that you kind of assent to or opt out of. Like, there are these items on a menu and you just pick one out and you go with it, and there's a unrestricted kind of freedom in the process. Do you know who David Berlinski is?
No.
He's I don't know how to describe him. He's a writer. He's a one-time philosopher. He gets on podcasts a lot. He's a dedicated atheist, but a strident defender of religion and the idea of God. So he was on a podcast once, and in usual fashion was speaking very passionately about God and religion. And the podcast host then asks him, why don't you just believe in God? It's very clear that you have this profound passion for God and religion more generally. And he paused, and his response was, because I'm a secular Jew and that's all that I ever have. I can't just not be a secular Jew. It's not that simple. It's not just a question of opting into the belief. There's something more embodied about it. I don't think he used that term per se, but yeah, I mean, that's just a side note, but I thought it was interesting and relevant to the discussion.
Yeah, that's a fascinating example. Yeah, I mean, in that book I was talking about, Secular Paradox, Joseph Lancome talks about similar kinds of things where people feel like, well, I didn't choose atheism. Like, it just happened to me, or I can't, choose whatever. And so, and yeah, to your point, that's a very interesting example of, it raises all sorts of interesting implications. I mean, anthropologically, it makes sense. From a theological perspective, it raises all sorts of a can of worms around questions of volition. Again, volition, accountability, salvation that would be fun to unpack and think through. But well, that's not our task right now.
But I think actually on that note, it actually gives some credence to the Salafi positions regarding, belief, الاعتقاد, or, الإيمان قول وعمل, اعتقاد وقول وعمل, right? So there's a component which is, belief in your heart, but also there's a component which is said out loud, the testimony, and then there's a component which is actually the action, and also the notion of الإيمان يزيد بالطاعات وينقص بالمعاصي, that belief increases with good deeds and decreases bad deeds. Like the action component is a key component, at least in the Salafi conception of belief or iman.
Yeah, if you want to go there, it's I feel like there was a portion, a section on this in the dissertation that I was developing, and then again, like I said, left it out. And it's something I want to think through further. But if you put the various kinds of theorizations of iman between the different schools in conversation with each other, I feel like you get some interesting puzzles and questions that come up. So this idea among the Ahl al-Hadith or the Salafis nowadays, that the commitment to the idea that iman increases and decreases, that action and obedience is part of, it's not just a kind of, it not just follows from faith, but it is part of faith, and is the completion of faith. But so then when when you read these texts, especially when you put them in conversation with each other, there's a certain assumption, there's a certain discomfort with doubt, though. There's a certain baseline assumption that there is, you have to have conviction in the heart at a kind of cognitive level. That is assumed, presumably, again, there's all sorts of ambiguities here that need to be teased out, but presumably at the very least, the shahada, when you testify that there's no God but Allah and the Prophet is his messenger, then that's often interpreted as, well, you have kind of conviction in that, and doubt is a very kind of dangerous state. And yet there is a recognition that, well, if it's fluctuating up and down through obedience and disobedience, but then here and there, but that you could square as a picture. Well, there's a baseline conviction, but then that conviction becomes firmer and firmer and more certain with practice and obedience. But then when they start to talk about, well, you have to repel shubuhat, right? There are like doubts and questions that come to the mind that you have to work through. And those increase certainty as well. So iman increases and decreases through discursive argumentation as well, and intellectual like reasoning. So then it's like, well, is there a baseline or is there no baseline? And if there's certainty, can certainty become more certainty and less certainty? Is it like, what is the phenomenology here of the experience of believing and of commitment? What are the different aspects of it? That, again, like I was saying, that volitional aspect of like, well, my mind just judges something as I'm convinced or I'm not convinced. Then there's inner talk of like, well, no, I'm accepting it, I'm not. There's all these different pieces, and each school of thought has certain answers worked out. But when you put it all together, I think there's a lot of interesting room for like thinking through like, well, how does doubt fit into the picture at the in the simplest way? But also, it also speaks to ideas around authenticity as well. So like if you take the idea that action and obedience is part of faith to its kind of, to a more, to a logical, push the envelope further to its more logical conclusion, you get what's attributed, the position that's attributed to Khawarij, for example, the so-called like extremists or whatever. And they, for them, if you do certain things, and the Mu'tazila held somewhat similar position, that like, if you do certain kinds of actions, then you no longer have faith. But then, because the assumption, I think that is a very strong position of personal authenticity, if we want to put it that way. This wholehearted commitment that like, if you really believed, if you were actually certain that God is out there and will judge you, and then you start disobeying God and violating all these things and not feeling and not repenting, then you clearly don't believe, and so you're not a believer. And other people are like, no, wait, it's not, we don't want to take that strong of a line. So there's a lot of puzzling, intriguing, rich things to parse through in that.
So I've got a couple of other questions. One I wanted to ask about was, you noted one point in the book that many of the sources of doubt and anxiety were not regarding Islam versus science, but rather Islam versus liberalism, and specifically Islam versus liberalism in its form as a sort of culture war. So in this context, I'm wondering how much of this is really a crisis of authenticity versus a crisis of authority. If you're familiar with the social theorist, British Muslim social theorist Salman Sayyid, he talks about this regarding the question of cynicism. So cynicism towards the Quran or towards Islam, that if Muslims become, cynical and opportunistic towards their faith, it's not because of postmodernism or some other kind of culture war notion. It's a marker of political disempowerment. It arises when one cannot imagine a future that's better for all, so then you kind of turn inward. In your case, obviously, if you're talking about doubt, it's about authenticity of self, and this depoliticizing move he's talking about, turning towards your own family and kind of disregarding the wider community. Do you think there's something to be said here, some kind of parallels perhaps?
That sounds fascinating. I don't think I fully follow I haven't heard him express this idea, and I'm not sure I fully get the connection between the cynicism towards the Quran or the Prophet and the being disempowered. I don't know if you want to expand on it before I try to answer.
Sure. I think what I was getting at is basically that I think it was brought into relief particularly by this notion that, the main source of doubt and anxiety that you note is not to do with science, which is often the case with many religious people who express doubt, but rather something to do with liberalism and values and norms, and something similar is afoot when we talk about, again, political disempowerment. You note throughout the book that Muslims are in a position of, especially in the West, of being minoritized, of securitization, and it's under these pressures where the succumbing to this pressure of liberal norms becomes a major source of doubt. Likewise, in the kind of thing that's laid out by Salman Sayyid, he talks about cynicism towards Islam as such, or cynicism towards Quran, or opportunism towards these things, and at the same time a turning away from the community. It's under the same pressures that these things are happening. It's not that people are doubting the Quran per se. It might be that they are pressured to kind of come to these positions due to the situation in which they find themselves, politically, economically, and so on.
A couple things come to mind. So, for one, I don't know to what extent this is the same. He's probably saying it in a slightly different vein, given what I know of, his orientation. But if we compare it to something I talk about in the book, is some of these authority figures, like in the Yaqeen Institute, for example, or Omar Suleiman saying that the all this kind of doubt and crisis is a result of kind of colonized mindsets, that there's this kind of experience. So you're seeing yourself and your tradition through the lens of your kind of colonial master and oppressor, and that's why people have these kind of conflicts. It sounds like he's saying something slightly different, but somewhat related. But just in responding to that way of framing it, at least before moving on to the second point, I would say that is obviously very much a source of the dissonance and doubt, is a kind of inferiority complex, is a kind of a way of internalizing and being and seeing all sorts of things as dysfunctions and embarrassments and vile and whatnot within our tradition or our community, because we've internalized a certain lens. But just as an example, the difference between most people that I've encountered doing this work, their reaction to the kind of incredibly pervasive trope of Muslims as inherently violent and terroristic versus the trope of Muslims as inherently patriarchal. Now, most American Muslims that I meet are not. It's a source of frustration, of it's something they struggle with, this idea that Muslims are violent and terroristic, etc. It might be a source of conflict at some level, but it's not. I would say there's a difference there. Like, most people are able to reject that charge much more easily than they are the charge of like Islam as inherently patriarchal. For those who find that troubling, for those who don't find it troubling, that's great. Um, but so, and I think that's because of the kind of lived experience within communities. Like, there's no communal authority kind of reinforcing those kinds of discourses that present Islam as, at least in a post 9/11 context in the US, a lot of these ideas around, have been kind of things that might be engaged in other contexts are kind of shied away from. And so that's not something people have to contend with within the community. Whereas like gender norms and ideas around gender and sexuality are very much at the heart of how people understand Islam. And so they butt up against that. One other thing I'll say is what came to mind when you were describing that question is, a conversation with one of your other guests, Sherman Jackson's Islamic Secular. And part of the way I read what he's doing in that project that I find valuable is the idea that, and I think this speaks to Salman Sayyid's kind of idea of like creating a kind of horizon of possibility of Muslim futures and stuff, is what Jackson talks about in terms of plausibility structures. That like, so there has to be a certain kind of like cultural frameworks that are kind of developed and put out there that people can relate to, that are not necessarily like Islamic and scriptural or like authorized as Islamic, but are put out as kind of a Muslim secular, let's say. I think I'm approaching it in a slightly different way, but kind of the cultural production that I think both of them are talking about, that creates a certain kind of givenness, that like we're embedded in a social reality where being Muslim and relating to the Islamic tradition is somewhat taken for granted, as embedded in our everyday life. That's not just a pietistic register of like Islam says XYZ creedally, doctrinally, more, like this is what's demanded of us. But that like, I watch TV shows that have these references, and I read fantasy books that have these references, and I listen to music that have these references, and all of it creates a certain kind of default order. So that the default order is not, well, white, post-Christian, like secular life is this default that I live in all the time. And then because I'm pietistic, I affirm these Islamic creeds in a somewhat like, abstract way. Like I believe this, but I live my life in a totally different way. You have to create an entire kind of plausibility structure, a kind of cultural milieu that takes certain things for granted, even if they're not technically Islamic, even if they might not abide by the hukum shari, like that Jackson was talking about. Like maybe the Islamic secular can be, a bit more capacious, but orients people towards a horizon of like, well, this is the life world we're building that has some kind of reference to a certain history, that has some kind of reference to God and the Prophet, even if not in necessarily like very direct or explicit ways, not in pietistic ways. So like, that probably doesn't get at exactly what you were asking about, but that's what comes to mind.
So I had a technical question coming out of the acknowledgements page, but also you mentioned it quite a few times during our discussion now, which I think might be of interest to some listeners. You mention that the book took different forms and kind of the centerpiece changed along the way. In particular, you mentioned that you did this in response to a manuscript review workshop. So to younger scholars, especially those who are either in the middle of writing their dissertations or maybe recently completed them, the prospect of such a central revision or change sounds immensely scary. So could you perhaps speak somewhat to that process and what someone might benefit from following through on that kind of a monumental decision?
So in some ways, the project never changed from the dissertation onwards. I kept on trying to figure things out, and in some ways kept on coming back to the same structure, very broadly speaking, of sorts, and ways of I wasn't able to, part of me wanted to, speaking of belief as a choice, a part of me wanted to try to figure out some other way of analyzing these things. And I kept on coming back to the same set of like frameworks to a certain extent, or structure. And I changed things up many times, but from after I finished the dissertation, I struggled to figure out what I was doing with it, and then finally came up with this somewhat semi-polished manuscript that I referred to earlier. I did this manuscript review workshop, got some very generous but constructive critical feedback. And what I thought I needed to do at the time was rewrite the intro. I was like, okay, this intro is not working, so I'm going to rewrite the intro. And so I started rewriting the intro, and before I knew it, I was writing about the imperatives of authenticity as a kind of key framework, and I hadn't quite intended to do that. And then the more I worked on it, the more that became the centerpiece of how I was framing the intro, and I was seeing, oh wow, this is a through line that connects things in the book that I had been struggling to connect between, like let's say part one and two of a not of this version of the book, but a previous. I hadn't figured out how to, and then I felt, oh, this personal authenticity stuff allows me to kind of draw the through line there and also speak to put it within the context of a certain audience. And so, but then I needed to kind of go through the chapters and reorganize material and make, reframe them to connect with the intro. So it wasn't like a total rewriting at any point. It was like, but that moment required like, okay, now that I've rewritten the intro entirely, I need to go through, and I substantially rewrote a lot of stuff. Like a lot of the stories in the analysis would stay, but the way I was narrating it and the kind of the threads I was drawing had to be changed. And then I rearranged a bunch of stuff. So that was a big process. But one thing I'll say is that a big part of what I was struggling with throughout the process was audience. I think I kept on. I had multiple audiences in my mind as I was trying to write this book. I had in mind the everyday kind of Muslim reader that I was trying to speak within the community that I'm trying to speak to, whether and their concerns, a certain kind of like a theological project, let's say, speaking to a broader like religious studies audience, and speaking and Islamic studies, and then American religion, and my colleagues for tenure. And and I just, what I ended up coming up with that first time didn't quite work for these purposes. And then the, the authenticity framework ended up allowing me to situate methodologically, like historically situating this a bit more, speaking to and deciding to situate it to American religion at some level more thoroughly than like an Islamic studies audience or like a, Muslim communal. I was like, look, like most people in the community aren't going to read my book anyways. They're going to maybe listen to a lecture if they're interested, or some interviews with guys from Muftah. Like I need to write this for my professional purposes, but also like write it in the way that like speaks to the scholarly audience, and not all the scholarly audiences that I'm embedded in. And then there will be opportunities like this one to then speak about things that I didn't write in the book. Like, I've talked more in this hour about like kalam and the Muslim intellectual history than I was able to include in the entire book, which is sad to me. It makes, at some level, I love that stuff. I studied it a lot, but I wasn't able to because I did end up deciding I'm going to situate this book and frame it within an American religion context. And that ended up making it sharper. And I'm actually, I think it's a much, I have my reservations and insecurities, but I'm much happier and proud of the way this book is than that first draft, even though I was pretty upset at the time. I will say, the months after that workshop, as I was trying to rework things, were the hardest in terms of my self-confidence. those were some of like, that was a really, really tough time to I think I was just really struggling with that insecurity and indecision and uncertainty. And so it wasn't easy. It worked out, I think for the better. I'll also add that it was also a function of privilege and eh, I would call it blessing of being in the kind of institution I am. So, I was given for that first version, I had a kind of a solid sabbatical, pre-tenure sabbatical that allowed me to kind of work at length even, and it was disrupted by COVID. But then because of COVID, they gave us the ability to postpone 1 year, and then when COVID continued 2 years, delay our tenure clock. And so my sabbatical was over when I did a lot of the heavy lifting, but I was able to have that time to kind of go back and change things up because we have the kind of flexibility. We were given that opportunity, and that maybe, you might not have. And so sometimes an imperfect product, it's like, it's never going to be perfect. This has all sorts of flaws in it. So, like, one of the messages of my book is also perfectionism can be the enemy of the good. So, with the book also, like, yeah, I ended up going through that process, but it would have been okay if I didn't, I guess. If I didn't have that kind of flexibility and time to do so. So those were the things that came to mind.
We're out of time, unfortunately, but I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for joining us, Zaid. We're going to have a part 2 at some point. I hope you can join us for a part 2 because
Really?
we have a lot of other questions we wanted to ask you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. This was very invigorating.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And to our listeners, we do hope you enjoyed this episode, and we welcome your comments, feedback, and suggestions. Send us an email at proteanview@muftah.org. Whether you're listening on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review or a like. This helps improve the visibility of the show. With your support, we can keep Protean View running and gradually improve it. Visit us at muftah.org and navigate to the Protean View tab to see all our episodes. And follow us on our socials using the handle @ProteanView, including on Patreon, where you can become a paid patron and receive exclusive content. Until next time.